It was May 10th, 1996. 47-year-old Yasuko Namba had no idea that achieving her greatest dream would cost her everything. Imagine this. You've just conquered the world's tallest mountain. You're standing on top of Everest, arms raised in triumph, knowing you've just made history. But within hours, everything turns into a nightmare. You're collapsed in the snow, unable to move, watching people walk past you. You can barely breathe, barely think, but you're still alive, still fighting, still hoping someone will come back for you. But they won't come back. In fact, what happens next will show you exactly why they left her to die on Everest again and again. This wasn't just another Everest tragedy. This was a story that would reveal the darkest truths about human nature when survival is on the line, and change how we think about rescue on the world's most dangerous mountain forever. Welcome to the extreme edge. The woman who would face the unthinkable on Everest was so much more than just another wealthy adventure tourist. Yasuko Namba was a personnel manager for FedEx, the kind of person who dealt with employee schedules, corporate meetings, and endless paperwork. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., she would step onto the crowded Tokyo subway in her perfectly pressed business suit, briefcase in hand, looking like every other office worker heading to another mundane day. But when 5 p.m. hit and she clocked out, Yasuko transformed into something completely different. She became a mountain climber with audacious dreams. Yasuko weighed barely 100 pounds. She stood maybe 5 feet tall. But this tiny woman had set her sights on something big, methodically planning expeditions to the world's most dangerous mountains. And not just any mountain. She wanted to climb the 7 summits. That's the highest peak on every single continent. Her FedEx colleagues probably thought she was crazy. I mean, imagine your quiet coworker from accounting suddenly announcing she's going to climb every continent's highest peak. That's exactly what Yasuko planned to do, and she wasn't kidding around. So, on New Year's Day, 1982, while most people were nursing hangovers and making resolutions they'd never keep, Yasuko was standing on top of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. 2 years later, she conquered Aconcagua in South America, a mountain where altitude sickness can kill you in hours. Then came Denali in Alaska, where temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees, and the weather can change from calm to deadly in minutes. Then Mount Elbrus in Russia, the Vinson Massif in Antarctica, with its 24-hour daylight and roaring winds, can literally blow climbers off the mountain. Each climb required months of preparation, training that would break most people, mental preparation for conditions that regularly claim lives, and she was doing all this as a small Japanese woman in the 1980s and 90s. Can you imagine the looks she must have gotten, the skepticism, the outright dismissal? But Yasuko had something that no amount of size or strength could replace, a will that was absolutely and completely unbreakable. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you want to be part of the extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. John Taskey, who would later climb with Yasuko on Everest, had this to say about her. She was a little lady. I've never met a girl more determined. About 100 pounds in weight, no more. But as far as determination goes, she was twice that weight in determination. By 1994, Yasuko had conquered 6 of the 7 summits. Only one mountain remained, and it was the tallest and most famous of them all, Mount Everest. So, on April 15th, 1996, Yasuko arrived at Everest Base Camp as a part of Robert Hall's Adventure Consultants expedition. Now, Robert was legendary in the mountaineering world. He was a New Zealander with an incredible safety record who had guided more people to Everest's summit than anyone else alive. If you were going to trust your life to someone on the world's most dangerous mountain, Rob Hall was your guy. Yasuko's Everest plan was straightforward. Like all climbers, she planned to spend several weeks at base camp doing acclimatization rotations, which meant climbing higher up the mountain, then coming back down to let her body adapt to the thin air. Her summit plan was simple too. When the weather window opened in early May, they'd climb from base camp to Camp 2, rest a day, then continue to Camp 3 for a short sleep. From there, they'd push up to Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet, where they'd clip into bottled oxygen and try to rest before summit day. The final push would start around 10 p.m. on May 9th. They'd climb through the night, reach the summit by late morning, take photos, and descend immediately. Robert had one non-negotiable rule: a hard turnaround time by early afternoon. If you weren't at the summit by then, you turned around, no exceptions. That was the plan. Clean, controlled, professional. Almost boring, in fact. But of course, if all had gone to plan, this would have been a very different story. Or no story at all. But it didn't. Because while Yasuko was methodically preparing her body for the summit push that May, something sinister was building on the mountain. You see, in 1996, Everest had a problem. It had nothing to do with the altitude, the cold, or even the technical difficulty of the climb. The problem was success. Rob Hall's adventure consultants had become so successful at getting clients to the summit that suddenly everyone wanted a piece of the action. A charismatic American climber named Scott Fisher had started his own guiding company called Mountain Madness, and he was determined to prove he could do what Hall did, maybe even better. But Fisher wasn't the only one eyeing Everest that spring. There was a Taiwanese expedition trying to put the first climbers from Taiwan on the summit. A South African team attempting to make history. Even the Indo-Tibetan border police were making their own summit bid. What this meant was that too many people were trying to climb the same mountain at the same time, and not just any mountain. We're talking about Everest, where the route to the summit is so narrow that in some places only one person can pass at a time. And to make matters worse, the weather reports coming into base camp that May were disturbing. Meteorologists were tracking a massive storm system moving toward Everest, and Everest storms are unlike any other. It's not just bad weather, but a weather bomb. I'm talking hurricane-force winds that could literally blow climbers off the mountain, combined with temperatures that would drop to below freezing. The kind of cold that can freeze your corneas and blind you permanently. Any sane expedition leader would have looked at these forecasts, at the crowd, and said, "We're staying in our tents until this passes." But here's the problem. The spring climbing season on Everest is incredibly short. There are maybe 2 or 3 brief windows when the winds die down enough to make a summit attempt even remotely possible. And this storm was going to close that window for weeks, maybe for the entire season. So expedition leaders found themselves facing an impossible choice: wait for the storm to pass and potentially miss their only shot at the summit, disappointing clients who had paid tens of thousands of dollars and trained for years, or gamble that they could get up and down the mountain before the weather hit. Rob Hall knew about the approaching storm. Scott Fisher knew about it. Every team leader on the mountain was getting the same horrifying weather reports. But summit fever, that dangerous obsession with reaching the top at any cost, was spreading through base camp like a virus. Clients had mortgaged their houses for this opportunity. Guides had reputations to maintain, and the competitive pressure between the different expeditions was making everyone take bigger and bigger risks. So, despite the weather warnings, despite the overcrowding, despite every red flag screaming at them to wait, almost every expedition made the same deadly decision. They would all attempt the summit on May 10th, 1996, and Yasuko was one of those climbers. On the evening of May 9th, Yasuko settled into her tent at Camp 4, trying to get a few hours of rest before the most important climb of her life. But sleep at 26,000 feet must have been nearly impossible. The air is so thin that your body fights for every breath, and the constant sound of wind battering the tent makes real rest almost impossible. At around 11:30 p.m., Yasuko began her final preparations. She checked her oxygen regulator, adjusted her headlamp, and made sure her down suit was zipped properly. And finally, around midnight on May 1996, Yasuko and the entire Rob Hall expedition team began climbing in what can only be described as one of the most challenging terrains on Earth. I can only imagine how she must have felt, breathing air so thin you can barely breathe, in complete darkness. Every step required conscious effort. The temperature was minus 20 degrees. Winds howling like a living thing, conditions that have taken the lives of hundreds of people. But Yasuko wasn't thinking about death. She was thinking about glory, about becoming only the second Japanese woman to complete the 7 summits, about proving that size means nothing when you have an unbreakable will. For the first few hours, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Yasuko moved steadily upward, her tiny frame somehow generating enough power to keep pace with much larger climbers. The weather was holding. Her oxygen was flowing properly. She felt strong and focused. But at the balcony, which is a tiny, narrow section leading up to the summit at about 27,600 feet, Yasuko ran into a nightmare she had never anticipated. She met a traffic jam. Remember when I said all those expeditions were attempting the summit on the same day? Well, this is where that decision really turned dark. Because what that meant was that Yasuko, along with more than 30 climbers, were all trying to climb the balcony, a narrow section where only one climber can cross safely, all at the same time. Now, this wasn't supposed to happen. On a normal summit day, there might be 5 or 6 people spread out over hours, but today, every expedition on the mountain had converged on the exact same route at the exact same day. What made this situation even more bizarre was what they discovered when they got there. The fixed ropes and safety lines that every climber depends on for survival were not even installed. Somehow, in the midst of all the planning and coordination between these professional expedition teams, a critical communication breakdown had occurred, and fixing life-saving ropes had somehow been ignored. The guides had to stop everything, install the ropes from scratch, while 30-plus climbers stood motionless in the death zone, burning through their precious oxygen supplies with every breath. Yasuko found herself trapped in this deadly queue, watching helplessly as the minutes ticked by. Minutes she would desperately need for her descent. Minutes that could mean the difference between making it home alive or becoming another statistic on the world's most dangerous mountain. At this, any other climber at this point would have doubts. Some might have even turned back. But Yasuko pressed on, driven by that unbreakable determination that had carried her up 6 other peaks. The traffic nightmare continued again at the Hillary Step, a 40-foot wall of rock and ice just 300 feet below the summit. Again, no ropes. Again, delays while guides scrambled to set up safety lines. And this time, only one person could climb at a time. Again, Yasuko was trapped in another deadly bottleneck. When she finally reached the Hillary Step, it was already 1 p.m. She was running dangerously behind schedule. But she was so close, just 300 feet from completing her life's dream. Just 300 feet from becoming the second Japanese woman to climb all 7 summits. And that's when summit fever took over completely. Instead of turning around like every safety protocol demanded, like Rob Hall's proven system required, Yasuko made the decision that felt impossible to avoid. She kept climbing. According to John Krakauer, who was also on the expedition, Yasuko was totally focused on the top. It was almost as if she were in a trance. She pushed extremely hard, jostling her way past everyone to the front of the line. At 2:30 p.m. on May 10th, 1996, after nearly 15 hours of climbing, Yasuko Namba reached the summit of Mount Everest. She had done it. She was officially one of only a handful of women to have climbed the 7 summits. At 47 years old, she was the oldest woman to ever summit Everest. For a few precious minutes, she stood on top of the world, taking photos, savoring what she thought was her greatest achievement. She probably thought about her husband, Kenichi, waiting for her back in Japan, about all the early morning training climbs, about the 14 years of preparation that had led to this moment. She had no idea that her real test was just beginning, because getting to the summit was only half the battle. What followed was a nightmare. So Yasuko had achieved her dream, but she was already in serious trouble. Robert's hard turnaround time had been 2 p.m., no exceptions, for a reason. You see, on Everest, afternoon weather is notoriously unpredictable and deadly. The mountain creates its own weather patterns, and storms can build with terrifying speed. But more importantly, when the sun goes down on Everest, temperatures fall even further. Your already limited visibility becomes almost zero. And if you're exhausted from a 15-hour climb, trying to navigate narrow ridges and technical terrain in the dark becomes a nightmare that kills people regularly. Robert's rule was based on years of experience and the simple math of survival. Leave the summit by 2 p.m. and you have enough daylight to make it back to Camp 4 before the mountain turns into a death trap. Miss that deadline and you're gambling with your life. Yasuko had just rolled the dice. Her descent started well enough. Yasuko was exhausted but moving, carefully making her way back down the Hillary step. She clipped into the fixed ropes, checked her oxygen flow, and began the long journey back to safety. For the first hour, everything seemed manageable, but as she descended, something sinister was happening around her. Remember that massive storm the meteorologists had been tracking since the start of May? Well, it was arriving right on schedule. The weather, which had been holding all day, was beginning to change. Dark clouds were building below them. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was starting to drop in a way that made experienced climbers nervous. By 4 p.m., as Yasuko continued to slowly make her way down the upper reaches of the mountain, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle snow you might see in a Christmas movie, but sharp, driving flakes that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility with every gust of wind. She wasn't descending alone. On her way down, fellow adventure consultant's client Beck Weathers was also making his way down, although struggling with vision problems that had been getting worse all day. Both climbers were moving slowly, too slowly, and they weren't the only ones in trouble. Mountain guide Mike Groom, one of Rob Hall's most experienced team members, found himself responsible for not just Yasuko and Beck, but also climbers from Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness team, whom Neil Beetleman was guiding. During emergencies like this, the artificial boundaries between expedition teams often dissolved. Guides helped whoever needed it most. As the afternoon wore on, the snow got heavier. The wind got stronger, and as visibility began dropping to almost nothing, Yasuko, Beck, and the Mountain Madness clients all remained high on the mountain, slowly coming down. So you had tired climbers, reduced visibility, and a storm rapidly approaching. It was a recipe for disaster, and Yasuko was right in the middle of it all. What happened next would test every person on that mountain in ways that still haunt the survivors today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By 6 p.m., that sharp snowfall had transformed into a nightmare brought to life. A full-scale blizzard with wind speeds that could knock you off your feet, snow so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, and temperatures that were dropping by the minute. The blizzard caught Yasuko and the other descending climbers still high up the mountain, trying to navigate narrow ridges with 1,000-foot drops on either side, trying to follow routes marked only by occasional flags and fixed ropes that were rapidly being buried by snow. In conditions like these, getting lost is the worst possible fate. It's practically a death sentence, and that's exactly what happened. Somewhere around 7 p.m., in the middle of the worst blizzard any of them had ever experienced, the unthinkable happened. They got lost. Yasuko, along with other desperate climbers, were all wandering together in a complete whiteout, unable to see where they were going, unable to find the trail, unable to locate their camp. The storm had turned Mount Everest into a death trap, and Yasuko was caught right in the middle of it. Now here's where Yasuko's incredible determination started working against her. Even as hypothermia began shutting down her brain, she kept insisting on carrying her gear, including her oxygen mask. The problem? Her oxygen had run out hours ago, but she clung onto it, convinced it was still working. Beck Weathers later described what he saw. She was diminutive, and some of her choice of gear reflected that. She had a variety of titanium things because she could not carry quite the same weight physically. She just didn't have the body power. Even worse, she was getting much colder much quicker than her fellow climbers. Why? Because at high altitude and extreme temperature, your body burns fat cells to keep warm long enough. And Yasuko, with her small body mass, was losing heat much faster than larger climbers. By 7 p.m., she was showing signs of severe altitude sickness. She kept dragging her feet and could not walk properly. At one point, guide Mike Groom had to physically support her as they descended through the worsening blizzard. But they kept moving, kept fighting, kept hoping that somehow they would find their way to safety. Even as they collapsed one by one from exhaustion and hypothermia, they kept faith that somehow all this would end well. Then, around midnight, something gave them hope. The storm had cleared, just enough for them to see the faint glow of Camp 4's lights less than 1,000 feet away. So close they could almost touch it. Safety at last. I can only imagine the relief on the guides' faces at seeing the camp. But when the guides turned back to check on their climbers, they had a problem. See, Yasuko and Beck were barely conscious. They were stumbling around like they were drunk, completely out of it, their bodies shutting down from the cold. Picture this moment. You're a mountain guide with 6 climbers at 26,000 feet, in hurricane-force winds, in complete darkness. In your group, there are 2 people who are barely conscious and unable to walk. You know that if you stay with them, all of you will die. But if you leave them, they'll definitely die. Mike and Neil Beetleman faced this exact situation. Both were experienced enough to know that in conditions like these, attempting to carry unconscious climbers back to camp would be suicide. Both knew what leaving them probably meant. Beetleman would later say it was the hardest decision he'd ever made, but staying would have meant 4 deaths instead of 2. After an agonizing discussion, they made the only decision that made sense. They would leave Yasuko and Beck in the snow and go for help. This was the first time Yasuko was abandoned. For the next 8 hours, Yasuko and Beck lay in the snow, completely exposed to hurricane-force winds and minus 40-degree temperatures. Beck would later describe the experience. Your whole clothes fill up with the driven snow and the ice that's coming at you. You don't even realize it so much at the time because everything is just nonstop cold and misery. But I can only imagine what those 8 hours must have felt like for Yasuko. Imagine lying in the snow at 26,000 feet, your tiny 100-pound body fighting a losing battle against the most brutal conditions on Earth. The wind is screaming at you with the force of a hurricane, driving ice crystals into your face like thousands of tiny needles. Every breath is a struggle, not just because of the thin air, but because your lungs are slowly filling with snow. But here's the thing that makes Yasuko's story so heartbreaking. She was still conscious, still aware of what was happening to her. Hypothermia doesn't end you quickly. It's not like drowning or falling. It's a slow, methodical shutdown of your body's systems. First, your extremities go numb. Your fingers and toes stop responding. Then your muscles start to stiffen. Your thinking becomes cloudy, confused. But your brain? Your brain keeps working just long enough to understand exactly what's happening to you. So there Yasuko was, lying in that snow, knowing she was dying, knowing that help was less than 1,000 feet away, close enough that on a clear day, she could probably see the camp, but it might as well have been on another planet. Did she think about her husband, Kenichi, probably sleeping peacefully in their bed in Tokyo, with no idea that his wife was fighting for her life? Did she think about all those morning subway rides, all those mundane corporate meetings that suddenly seemed precious beyond words? Maybe she thought about Mount Kilimanjaro on New Year's Day 1982, how proud she felt standing on that summit. The whole world seems possible. Or Denali in Alaska, where she proved that a tiny Japanese woman could conquer mountains that broke grown men twice her size. Or maybe, as the cold crept deeper into her bones, she thought about something simpler. Maybe she just wanted to go home. The cruel irony is that Yasuko had done everything right. She had trained for years. She had conquered 6 of the world's most dangerous mountains. She had followed every safety protocol, trusted the best guides in the business, and prepared for every possible scenario. Everything except this one. Everything except being abandoned in a blizzard, watching her body shut down piece by piece, while safety lay just beyond her reach. As the hours dragged on, Yasuko's body temperature continued to drop. At some point during that endless night, she probably stopped shivering, not because she was getting warmer, but because her body no longer had the energy to generate heat. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became shallow, but she didn't give up, even as her fingers turned black with frostbite, even as her face swelled beyond recognition. That unbreakable determination that had carried her up 6 peaks kept her fighting. John Taskey had been right. She was twice her weight in determination, and even dying, she proved it. When dawn finally broke on May 11th, after 8 hours of exposure that should have killed her several times over, Yasuko was still alive. Barely, impossibly, but alive. Yasuko probably didn't know this, but the search party wasn't just a random group of volunteers. It was led by Stuart Hutchison, one of her own teammates from Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants expedition. Hutchison was a doctor, ironically, exactly the kind of person you'd want to find you in a medical emergency. He was also one of the few climbers who had turned around before reaching the summit the day before, which meant he was in better shape than most people at Camp 4. With him were 2 Sherpas who had risked their own lives to venture out into the aftermath of the storm. These weren't a proper rescue team, just experienced high-altitude climbers who understood exactly how dangerous it was to be searching for bodies in the death zone. They could have stayed safe in camp, but something about leaving people on the mountain didn't sit right with them. This small search party had fought their way through the remnants of the blizzard, following the route where they thought Yasuko and Beck had been left. They were expecting to find corpses. What they found instead was far more complicated. Yasuko was breathing, shallow, barely perceptible breaths, but breathing nonetheless. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't signal for help in any meaningful way. Severe hypothermia had turned her body into a prison, trapping her conscious mind inside a shell that no longer obeyed her commands. The search team checked her pulse, labored but steady. When they called her name, she seemed to respond, not with words, because her body was far too gone for speech, but with a slight movement, a flicker of recognition that showed them that she was still there, still fighting, still hoping someone would save her. But Dr. Hutchison knew the brutal mathematics of high-altitude rescue better than almost anyone. He'd been climbing for years, had seen what hypothermia this severe meant, had made these impossible calculations before. As he knelt there in the snow, checking Yasuko's vitals with hands that were already going numb from the cold, his medical training was telling him something his heart didn't want to accept. Even if they could somehow carry her back to Camp 4, and that was a massive if, given that she was dead weight and they were all operating on fumes at 26,000 feet, what then? There was no helicopter rescue possible at this altitude, no emergency room, no IV fluids or warming blankets or any of that equipment that might give someone with severe hypothermia a fighting chance. The nearest medical facility that could handle something like this was in Kathmandu, at least a week away by foot, through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Even if they could somehow get her that far, it would require a team of Sherpas, perfect weather, and a miracle. Her core body temperature had dropped so low that her organs were already shutting down. As a doctor, he knew that even in a fully equipped ICU, in the best hospital in the world, Yasuko's chances would be slim to none. Here, at 26,000 feet, with no equipment and no help coming, those chances dropped to 0. So they made the decision that high-altitude rescue teams make all the time, but which feels different when you're looking into the eyes of someone who's still fighting. They left her there to die, again. For the second time in 12 hours, Yasuko watched people walk away from her. This time, she knew they weren't coming back. What must those final hours have been like for her? Did she understand what was happening? Did she blame the guides who had to make an impossible choice? Did she blame herself for pushing past the turnaround time? Or did she just lie there, alone with her thoughts, as her body finally gave up the fight it had been waging all night? We'll never know what Yasuko was thinking in those final moments, but we do know this. She died as she had lived, with incredible courage, facing impossible odds, refusing to give up even when giving up would have been merciful. Yasuko Namba closed her eyes for the final time on May 11th, 1996, less than 1,000 feet from safety, having been abandoned not once but twice by people who had no choice but to choose who lived and who died. Her death sparked debates about rescue ethics that continue to this day. How much risk is one life worth? When do you save yourself versus trying to save someone else? Where do you draw the line between heroism and suicide? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're life and death decisions that climbers face every season on mountains around the world. And while there are no easy answers, Yasuko's story serves as a powerful reminder of what's at stake when we push the limits of human endurance. She had achieved her dream of climbing all 7 summits. She had become the oldest woman to summit Everest. She had proved that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Maybe that's not the best lesson we should take away from her story. Maybe the lesson is simpler, that courage isn't about never being afraid or never facing impossible odds. It's about facing them anyway, about fighting until the very end, even when you know the end is coming. And by that measure, Yasuko Namba was one of the most courageous people who have ever lived. What do you think about the decisions made that night on Everest? Should the guides have stayed with Yasuko and Beck, even if it meant everyone would die? Or did they make the only choice that made sense in an impossible situation? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.